Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Experts Insights webinar series. I'm your host, Avery Zimmerman, and today's session is focused on tailoring your CSR for a successful submission, presented by MMS. As an innovative data-focused CRO, MMS brings insights from our global team of highly respected data and regulatory experts across 4 continents. As a reminder, your microphones will be muted for this session, and we'll send out a recording following the webinar. If you have questions, please ask them at any time in the Q&A icon at the top right of your screen. We'll answer them at the conclusion of today's session. Here to present today is Michelle Reed, Senior Medical Writer, Nicole Rudolph, Medical Writer, and Laura Alionte, Principal Medical Writer. With that, I'll turn it over to them.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Today, we will be discussing what is a CSR and its place and role in submissions, types of CSRs based on the format, study phase, and timing, as well as other types of CSRs, preparing your best fit-for-purpose CSR, and concluding with the summary and take-away messages. What is a clinical study report? A clinical study report is a formal regulatory document that describes the conduct and results of a clinical study, including details on how the data were collected and analyzed. This report is generally written after the completion of the study, but may be written to report interim results as well. All results of clinical studies have to be submitted within 1 year or 6 months for pediatric studies. CSRs are essential components of regulatory submissions. So, where do CSRs fit? The CSR is ultimately a component of the regulatory submission for marketing applications across Europe, Japan, and the United States. Every study that was conducted in humans with a study drug must be summarized in a CSR. Within the Common Technical Document, or CTD, there's a set of specifications for application dossier for the registration of medicines and are designed to be used across Europe, Japan, and the United States. It is organized into 5 modules, as you can see in the triangle. Module 1 being region-specific, and modules 2 to 5 are intended to be common for all regions. As you can see, the CSRs fit within Module 5 in the CTD. It is important to note that a full CSR contains a brief standalone synopsis, which is also included in Module 2.7.3. Regional regulatory guidance for CSR format and content allows flexibility depending on the type of study and submission. These guidances or guidelines are not requirements, but assist sponsors in the development of a CSR that is complete, free from ambiguity, well organized, and easy to review that will assist with successful submission. The ICH E3 guideline and the E3 Q&A document, which helps to facilitate this guideline, provides a recommended template for full CSR and guidance for content. It indicates the recommended full format that can be abbreviated for certain studies, such as studies that are not pivotal for claiming effectiveness or when a study is discontinued early, as will be expanded on later in this webinar. But this guideline does not provide a description of content. The FDA guidance is the only regulatory document that outlines when the abbreviated or synoptic format should be submitted and which sections can be included, depending on the role of the CSR within the regulatory submission. The EMA guidance does not provide any further guidance on abbreviated or synoptic format, but it does align with the ICH E3 guideline. Additional guidances are available for the appendices to be included per CSR format, but these will not be discussed in this webinar. Within the FDA guidance, a general overview is provided to help determining the types of studies to be submitted and its roles in the submission. This helpful decision tree indicates the three main recommended formats that can be adapted based on the study types or submission needs. Selecting the correct format is critical for effective communication and authoring and a successful submission. I will now hand over to Michelle, who will expand on selecting and tailoring a CSR format.
Thank you, Nicole. In the next section, we're going to explore some strategies for selecting a CSR format and tailoring it to the specific attributes of the study. So the first consideration when tailoring a CSR to fit a particular study is starting with the right template. A good quality template will provide the necessary structure to facilitate writing, but is also flexible enough to be tailored to the type of study being presented. Some of the key considerations that will dictate how a template is customized to accurately capture a study are the phase of the study, the timing of the CSR relative to the study completion, and whether there are special characteristics that may necessitate a more creative approach to writing. Although the ICH E3 guidelines, which we touched on earlier, are mainly aimed at efficacy and safety trials, the basic principles and structure described can be applied to other kinds of trials, such as clinical pharmacology studies. Depending on the nature and the importance of such studies, a less detailed report may be more appropriate. But ultimately, a well-written CSR will not only provide standalone support in submissions to health authorities, but will also facilitate the creation of key Module 2 documents in a submission, ultimately saving time and money for the sponsor. So the terminology used to describe report types can be confusing, and it tends to vary by sponsor. Using the FDA guidance, we can define three types of CSRs based on format. The first type, of course, is the full CSR, and this CSR will include all ICH E3 recommended sections. This can be numbered either 1 through 16, as has been traditionally done, or we are increasingly seeing usage of tech-enabled templates, such as the MMS Smart Start template. And these are Trancelerate-based templates that do not have the same section numbering as the ICH recommendations, but do have the same information in the same general location in the document. These Trancelerate-based templates are very lean, so they can be used for abbreviated or synoptic purposes. But generally, when we're speaking of a full CSR, we're referring either to the ICH E3 recommended section 1 through 16 format or to a tech-enabled Trancelerate-based template. Coming off of a full CSR, an abbreviated CSR is similar to a full CSR, but certain sections have been omitted. So this means that you end up with a shorter, more concise document. Abbreviated CSRs can be based on a separate template, or they can be modified version of a full template as well. And finally, a synoptic CSR, which is sometimes referred to as a synopsis in regulatory guidance, is a condensed version of a full CSR. So instead of including only selected sections, such as an abbreviated template, a synoptic template will focus on presenting a synoptic presentation of the information for that study. Studies that do not contribute to the evaluation of the effectiveness of a product for a specific indication can be submitted as either abbreviated reports or as synoptic reports. However, these two formats should not be used for studies that contribute to efficacy labeling as the sole CSR. So to drill down a little bit further into the three different formats, full CSRs should be used for all studies that are designed to support an efficacy claim, as I mentioned, for either the dose, regimen, population, or indication with the IMP. These contain all sections of the template following ICH organization, or they can be in a legacy format depending on the start date of the study. They summarize the data and the outcomes at the end of the study. or for marketing authorization. And finally, the scenarios for use for this type of template would be, they can be used for a final or an interim report, and I will get into that a little bit later on what that means. This type of template should be used for any study contributing to the evaluation of efficacy of a medical product. An abbreviated CSR format can be used for any study that is not intended to support the efficacy claim for a product, but that includes valuable safety information. And as such, these should include a full description of safety data, and safety and aspects should always be included. These typically include a summary of data. It does omit certain CSR sections, and abbreviates methods, and may abbreviate efficacy information. However, the safety information should be comprehensive. This is a condensed version of a full CSR, and the typical scenario for use with an abbreviated CSR template would be a study that was discontinued for futility or due to business decisions, and for studies that are used to support safety, or simply to show that they don't cast doubt on the efficacy of a product. And finally, synoptic CSR templates can also be used once again for studies that are not being used to support efficacy, but that are needed for a full evaluation of safety. Typically, these studies will include a summary of disposition, PK, clinical pharmacology, or efficacy data in an abbreviated format, but they will include complete safety. Usually in these CSRs, there are no in-text tables unless the study or reference drugs or severe adverse events need a table. These are typically used when efficacy is not, the efficacy data from that study is not being used for the application. Once again, used for studies that support safety or to show that they don't cast doubt on efficacy. So once an appropriate CSR format has been selected, the report can be further modified based on additional characteristics of the study. So for example, the phase of the clinical trial, the completed report for a phase 1 pharmacokinetics trial compared to a phase 3 pivotal trial will be very different. The timing relative to the study completion date of a study will also impact the final CSR. The timing with respect to when that study completion date occurs does need to be taken into consideration when selecting a template, and it can also impact the strategy for data presentation, which I'll get to in a little bit more detail in a minute. And finally, if there are any other characteristics of the study, in some scenarios, it may be deemed necessary to, say, present subpopulation analyses in a separate report, or less commonly, the study may derive results from an existing data source rather than a novel interventional trial. And I will touch on some of these in a little more detail in the next few slides. So full templates can be modified as needed to fit the study. Phase 1, when dealing with a phase 1 clinical trial, the ultimate purpose for the CSR in submission context would be to support dosing in subsequent clinical trials, as well as to present safety data. These studies tend to be fairly small, and they typically focus on PK/PD and safety, and they're typically conducted in healthy volunteers or in a disease-specific population. When phase 2 clinical trials are presented, they typically are intended to support preliminary efficacy, but also focus heavily on safety and may also focus on methodology for subsequent phase 3 trials. So this could include dose finding for further phase 2 or phase 3 studies as well. These trials are typically a little bit larger, and they're typically conducted in the disease-specific population. When writing phase 3 clinical trials, these are typically focused on evidence of efficacy, but also, of course, focus heavily on safety data. And these can also include comparisons with existing treatments to demonstrate non-inferiority. These typically are large studies that include thousands of subjects, and they require a thoughtful approach to place the efficacy and safety results and considerations of these results front and center in the results and discussions sections. And finally, in the phase 4 section, these are post-marketing data studies. And these studies typically focus on acquiring additional safety data. They can look at long-term risks and benefits and the optimal use of a product post-marketing. And these studies tend to be very large. They are looking at expanded subject populations beyond what was tested during phase 1 through 3 trials. Typically these studies are either, they can be controlled studies or they can be drawn from epidemiological data. So another big consideration when tailoring a CSR is based on the timing of the data that is reported. Some studies have predetermined interim analyses, and these early analyses are written before final analysis of the primary endpoint or before last subject, last visit occurs, typically using a database cutoff. This type of CSR will provide the full description of primary endpoints, but not provide the secondary or long-term analyses. In this scenario, a full format would be the best for presenting the data for this study, this would be either termed a full report or an interim report, depending on the sponsor. And this is where all the analyses are included for a database cutoff. For a primary endpoint analysis, so this may be something that is, say, determined by a number of events occurring within a study, for example. This would be a scenario in which you would be writing what could be termed an interim or a final CSR. This could also be the point at which last patient, last visit occurs. This would be best written on a full CSR template in order to use this study results to support efficacy. However, if at a predetermined analysis futility is declared, or if a study is terminated for some reason, this could be a place at which an abbreviated or synoptic CSR template would be appropriate for presenting the data. Upon reaching last subject, last visit, this is typically a final CSR. So this would be presenting mature primary endpoint analyses. The preliminary or mature safety data, depending on the characteristics of the study, would be presented. This would be presented in a full CSR format, once again, unless the study was terminated for some reason or is not going to be used to support efficacy of the product, in which case an abbreviated or synoptic template would be used. And then finally, for long-term follow-up, so in cases of, for example, oncology studies where the patients are followed for a long time for additional safety signals, this would be a scenario in which a supplemental CSR would be prepared. So, for example, presenting the mature safety data from a long-term study. This would be a place in which a full CSR format could be used, but an abbreviated or synoptic CSR template may be appropriate, as there would be previous CSRs on the same study presented that may present most of the information for a study already. So in this scenario, it would be appropriate to use an abbreviated or synoptic CSR template. So finally, there are some other special scenarios that may be applicable to a CSR that would require consideration into how the data is presented. So for example, for a subreport, this is typically a review of subgroups, such as a subgroup based on a country of origin, race, specific disease characteristics, etc., within a primary CSR. So a subreport is typically prepared. It may even be its own standalone CSR, but it usually does not include additional data that is not presented within the primary CSR. This typically is a data cut that may be prepared either ad hoc, or it may be planned as part of study analyses. Methodology study CSRs are also require some consideration. These studies develop and refine research methods for future trials, and they may ultimately be applicable to more than one drug. So to provide an example, that would be proof of concept trials or surveillance for an infectious disease in a specific population. Outcomes research study CSRs also require some special attention. These research the outcomes and assess the effects of drug quality of life. They usually require large sample sizes, so much larger than a phase 3 study, to show meaningful differences between treatments. So an example of this would be, say, a health system database analysis of long-term outcomes in a patient population. And finally, non-interventional study CSRs are also important. So these would be studies in which no study interventions are being applied to a participant population. So this could be where the data is drawn from epidemiological sources, or it could be a query of an existing database from a previous study. Since these study types involve no new interventions or minimal interventions with the patient population, the results sections of the CSRs need to be structured to best present the heavy data analyses that are inherent to these types of studies. So now that we have gone into some detail on considerations for selecting the best CSR format and tailoring it to the characteristics of a specific clinical study, I will hand over to Lara to further explore CSR preparation strategies.
Thanks very much, Michelle. So in the next section, we will look at some strategies for creating a fit-for-purpose CSR based on study characteristics, as well as the role of the study in the regulatory submission. So we sometimes think of a CSR as a standalone document. However, we have to remember that a CSR is an integral and pivotal part of a regulatory submission. Therefore, when preparing a CSR, we should start with the end in mind. Understanding the study and the role of the study in the submission will help tailor our CSR for successful downstream submission. Here are some examples of questions that we can ask up front that will enable the authoring team to create a CSR that is submission focused and is also compliant with regulatory guidelines. So the first question we can ask is this an efficacy and safety study, or is it a PK/PD, or is it a bioavailability or bioequivalence study? Is there a control group? And if so, is the control a placebo group, or is it an active comparator? This will allow us to organize the content and focus on the analyses that are most important for key messaging and for conclusions in the CSR, as well as other documents that are part of the submission. Another question we can ask is, what is the status of the study? Is the study complete? Is it ongoing, or was it discontinued? So knowing the study status will affect the content that we present in the CSR, as Michelle presented previously. And this will also affect the verb tense we use when writing the CSR, depending whether we're including the complete study data or if we're including only interim data as of a certain data cutoff date while the study is still ongoing. If the study was discontinued, for example, due to efficacy, safety, or feasibility, a full report is generally not necessary. However, the reason for termination of the study should be clearly stated in the report. Another question that's important is to know whether all the data was there any data from this particular protocol presented in a previous report. So it's important to know this because we need to know whether we need to describe all the data collected in the CSR or only supplemental data since the previous report, since we don't want to repeat the information. For supplemental reports, an abbreviated template may be appropriate. Another question is, where will the CSR be submitted? Will the CSR be submitted to the FDA in support of a new drug application, or will it be submitted to the EU in support of a marketing authorization application, or to other areas of the world? This is important because regulatory agencies may have specific requirements for the CSR format, also for the title page or certain appendices that include regional information. For submission to the EU, for example, CSRs will have to be compliant with the EU clinical trial regulation with respect to certain requirements for disclosure of personal data or company confidential information. And finally, another very important question is, will the CSR support the efficacy claim for the proposed dose, regimen, population, indication, or a related indication? So for CSRs that support an efficacy claim, a full CSR format should be submitted with a thorough presentation of efficacy and also considering any nuances that are required for the label. For studies that are not designed to establish efficacy for the claim submitted, abbreviated reports may be acceptable. So on the next slides, we will look at some scenarios of how we can utilize the FDA decision tree that we saw earlier in the presentation to choose the appropriate CSR format based on study attributes and the role of the CSR in the submission. So the first scenario is for a phase 3 placebo-controlled study with interim analysis of efficacy for the proposed indication in support of the label and long-term safety. So this study is placebo-controlled, so it's a well-controlled study, and it evaluates the effectiveness of the product for the indication for which a marketing approval is sought. Therefore, a full CSR should be submitted. And I just want to mention as a side note that the word should in agency guidance documents means that something is suggested or recommended, but not necessarily required. For a full CSR, all ICH E3 sections are required following ICH E3 structure or a Transalorate-based template, such as our MMS and a Smart Start template, including full information on study design, rationale, methodology, and conduct, and all applicable appendices and narratives. A full CSR should be used for the description of interim analysis data, as Michelle mentioned previously, up to the cutoff date, to present the efficacy data and interim safety data, which is incomplete, and a supplemental CSR that's written after the last subject last visit will present any additional data. So the supplemental CSR should not repeat the data from the first report, but just refer to it. Also, I want to mention that the procedure to maintain the blind when interim analyses are performed should be thoroughly explained. The second scenario that we will look at is for a phase 2 active controlled study for a related indication. So this study is not intended to contribute to the evaluation of product effectiveness for the indication for which a marketing approval is sought. Therefore, a full CSR is not required. This is an efficacy study conducted for a related indication. Therefore, per the FDA guidance, an abbreviated report should be submitted along with a safety data set. For this type of abbreviated CSR, sections should be concise and not as comprehensive as in a full report, and certain sections and appendices can be omitted. Per the ICH E3 guidance, there should be enough detail of design and results to allow the regulatory authority to determine whether a full report is needed. The methods should be concise, and the efficacy is suggested by the guidance to be primarily in tabular format, but should not cast any doubt on the effectiveness of the product for the proposed indication. Also, an abbreviated CSR should contain a full description of safety, including all safety data sets. The next scenario we will consider is for a phase 1 PK flawed and discontinued study. So this study is not intended to contribute to the evaluation of product effectiveness for the indication for which a marketing approval is sought. Therefore, a full CSR is not required. In addition, the study is a clinical pharmacology study with a defect of whether it's in design or data handling or analysis. And this defect renders it incapable of supporting useful or relevant conclusions. Therefore, per the FDA guidance, a synoptic report should be submitted for this type of study along with the safety data sets. As a reminder, for a synoptic CSR, a summary of the study disposition, PK, PD, or efficacy data, whichever is applicable, should be provided. A complete discussion of the safety data should be appended. However, in some cases, such as a flawed study like this example, a complete discussion of safety may not be relevant and can be omitted completely. Generally, no in-text tables are included unless SAEs require a table, and no section numbering is needed. The ICH E3 section 2 synopsis template can be used as a starting template for this type of synoptic CSR. The study protocol and protocol amendments, which are in section 16.1.1 of the ICH E3, should be provided along with the synoptic report. And finally, I would like to conclude with some takeaway messages from our presentation. In summary, CSRs can be categorized based on format, study status, and other study characteristics. The full CSR format can be modified depending on the type of study and its role in the submission. For studies that do, for example, for studies that do not support the proposed label, a less detailed report, such as an abbreviated or synoptic format, might be appropriate. Sponsors should discuss the planned report format and the study data presentation and analyses for a specific CSR with the reviewing authority at the earliest possible time. So for example, during pre-IND or pre-NDA meetings. The goal is to report data in a CSR that is essential to document effectiveness and safety of a product, and also to minimize the need for agencies to come back and request a full CSR or additional data for studies that were initially reported in an abbreviated or synoptic format. At MMS, we have various tools that are available to assist with CSR authoring, such as our Smart Start tech-enabled templates. And we also have a tool called Automatic, which is used for formatting and style. In addition, our expert regulatory strategists can advise regarding the CSR needs for successful submission, and our skilled medical writers can ensure that the CSR is fit for purpose and meets all regulatory guidelines. Thank you very much. This concludes my section of the presentation. Back to you, Avery.
Great. Thank you, Laura, Nicole, and Michelle for your insights. Before we move on to the Q&A, we'd like to share a little more about the host of this webinar, MMS. MMS Holdings has a proven scientific approach to complex trial data and regulatory submission challenges, and is a CRO with the largest number of in-house writers in the industry, with writers in the US, EU, South Africa, and India. Sponsors working with MMS for medical writing support can find greater efficiencies by working with us for QC, regulatory operations, and utilizing our tech-enabled writing templates. Email info@mmsholdings.com to learn more about our services or to speak with an expert. Now we'd like to move on to the Q&A portion of this webinar. Okay, so we have the first question. What are the impacts if a full CSR is submitted instead of the alternative formats?
Thanks, Avery. I can take this question. This is a great question. It's actually a question that we looked at as we were preparing this presentation, because we wanted to check what this impact would be. We wanted to get the expertise of our regulatory strategists on this, and there is really no consequence from the regulatory authority if we use a full format, when an abbreviated or synoptic format may be acceptable, as we based on the scenarios that we looked at earlier. So the only consequence would be that extra time is needed to author a full CSR, and there would be an extended review on the regulatory authority part. So this causes inefficiencies for both the sponsor as well as the regulatory authority. So no real repercussions for sending a full CSR instead of a shorter abbreviated or synoptic, just an efficacy issue. We don't want to, extend the timeline and for writing, for authoring, as well as review. However, I just want to mention, on the other hand, if we submit an abbreviated format or a synoptic format instead of a full CSR, this may be problematic, and the agency may come back and request that a full CSR is submitted, or they may request additional information, and this could cause delays. So we want to make sure where this is needed, based on the scenarios we looked at, that we do submit a full CSR for important studies for to support the label or examine effectiveness of a product intended for marketing. Thank you. I hope this answers your question.
Okay, so the next question is, what does MMS use to help their authors for synoptic and abbreviated CSRs?
I can take this question. So at MMS, we've developed and maintain format-specific CSR templates. And these template documents include not only up-to-date regulatory guidance, but also instructional text. This instructional text helps indicate what needs to be included in the different sections of the CSR. And this also includes our Smart Start template, which is our most recently developed template at MMS. In each section, we have information that can be used to help tailor specifically to the characteristics of the study being presented. So this is a very useful tool for our writers to know, to consider the best way to present information, or the best strategy for presenting that information. In addition, we do have subject matter experts in-house who are responsible for ensuring that we do stay up to date with regulatory guidance. And these individuals are available to help us decide the best format for a study, and to help answer questions that may come from a sponsor or may come from the medical writer in trying to determine the best way to present information for a particular study in a clinical study report.
Okay, the next question is, how does authoring a synoptic or abbreviated CSR affect timelines?
I'll take this one. So usually when drafting a full CSR, we follow a 2-draft review. That also includes QC and publishing. And by using the synoptic or the abbreviated CSR, we still follow this review cycle, but the writing time and the review time may be shortened because there is less information that needs to be included in the body of the CSR. So that would help to shorten the timelines a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, so we have another question. Where can one locate samples of CSRs on the internet?
So there are now public disclosure requirements for clinical study reports. These they are publicly available. I believe clinical trials, Laura, maybe you can answer this question. As far as public disclosure is concerned, I know that
clinicaltrials.gov.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should be able to access CSRs there. And I'm not sure the European trial registry, I think, also discloses the results of the trial. I don't think you will find the full CSR there, but you will find a summary of the results. Yeah, that's yeah. So it would be clinicaltrials.gov would be the best source for that information.
Okay. If you have additional questions on what you heard today, please follow up with your point of contact directly or email info@mmsholdings.com and we'll direct you to a presenter. For additional free webinars, visit info.mmsholdings.com/webinars or follow us on LinkedIn for updates. Thank you very much for listening and have a nice rest of your day.